All right, welcome again to our GeoSLU seminar series. My name is Henning Losbush, and I'm the Director of Business Development and Outreach here at the Geospatial Institute. And we're putting on these seminars as a platform for an exchange of ideas to share some of our work with students across the different colleges and departments here at St. Louis University, to give our industry partners an idea and a flavor of the different types of work that's going on around location science or using location science. So in that spirit, please be sure to use the Q&A box to address your questions to the presenters. And if you're really burning to ask questions in person or have something to contribute, we can even invite you onto our stage. So this conversation is recorded, and in fact, you can see the recordings of the previous sessions we had in our spring GeoSLU seminar series on the same website that you used to register for these. All right. So real quick summary of the Geospatial Institute here at St. Louis University. Our mission is to understand our changing world for informed decision-making on the ground and from above, connected through space and time. And we envision building a regional hub and internationally recognized center of excellence in geospatial science through impactful, multidisciplinary, and innovative research, education, partnerships, and services. And it seems to me that we're well on our way to establishing that and establishing it for the entire St. Louis region. Our institute is built on 3 pillars: research, and these seminars give you a good idea of the different research areas that we're involved in, from remote sensing to health to socioeconomic inequities, climate change, disaster response. It's pretty wide-ranging and amazing how location science can support all these different activities. We obviously have excellent educational programs and certificates. For example, we have a health certificate, which one of our presenters today, Kemba, is obtaining that while she's here. And then finally, we have a data services component to our institute that allows the SLU community, faculty, to get some support in submission of grants or completion of grants through either data collection, data management, analysis, or visualization centered around geospatial elements. Okay. So if you want to hear more from us, you can sign up for our newsletters on our website on the landing page, which is slu.edu/geoslu. There's a link at the bottom. And if you're interested in learning more from the student side, if you go to the Education and Training tab, there's another sign up on our page. All right, but let's get to the good and fun stuff. We have 2 great presentations today. And let's just get right into it. So our first presenter is Kemba Noel-London. And she is a health equity researcher with an interest in exploring the organizational and policy level influences on physical activity disparities, the organizational structures that facilitate or impede youth access to healthcare. Additionally, she is exploring disparities in sport and physical activity opportunities and the relationship between sport and the mental and physical health outcomes of youth who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. She also uses spatial analysis to examine how geography, societal context, and public policy drive youth health disparities in minority communities, specifically disparities within physical activity, sport opportunities, and access to healthcare. She currently serves as lab manager of the Dr. Rhonda Bidlou and Dr. Kimberly Enard Safety Net Healthcare Advocacy Research and Policy Collective, SHARP. She also works as an athletic trainer at underserved high schools in the St. Louis area and serves on the advisory board of the Clyde C. Miller High School Health Professionals Program. And I've also learned that she is defending her dissertation next week. So that is quite exciting for her. So Kemba, why don't you come and join us here on stage and share your work with us. And while Kemba comes on, let me remind everybody to use the Q&A box to ask questions as they kind of pop in your mind, or do so at the end. I believe
my computer decided to take a sabbatical right at this moment. So give me 1 second.
Perfect timing, absolutely no problem. That's more slow, I guess. All right, so we can see the PowerPoint of your the PowerPoint software on your screen right now.
Okay, let's see. Hopefully it presents. There we go.
Okay, I cross my fingers. There we go.
Okay. Seeing the presentation or the notes?
Yeah, swap the.
Okay, there we go. All right.
All right, we got it. Excellent.
Yay. All right, let me show my face now. Crisis averted. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Kemba Noel-London. As Henning said, I am a doctoral candidate in the College of Public Health and Social Justice. I am an athletic trainer by training. So my research today is kind of just looking at something called the Sport Diversity Index, which I created to help kind of reframe how we think about physical activity through interscholastic sports, and then like particularly looking at the St. Louis region. Okay. Okay, so first kind of understanding why sport in general. So the whole school, whole community, whole child coordinated school health framework centers the student at the center of that coordinated health, at the center of that coordinated health framework, acknowledging that the interplay of a child's life and then the context, so their environment where they live and all those kind of things as well, have a role on their academic success. So what we're seeing here is the comprehensive school physical activities program, which is part of that whole school, whole community, whole child framework, which is kind of designed to help school districts have the tools to be able to provide well-rounded and multiple opportunities for physical activity for their students. And part of that is also offering intramural and interscholastic sports, both before and after school when possible. And they're still kind of under the key context of our environment being safe and supported. So we know that participating in sports could have a lot of positive impacts on adolescent health, from physical health to psychosocial benefits and those kind of things. However, interscholastic sport is decreasing, and it can also be constrained by district resources and funding as well. So multiple studies and reports have shown that kids from low SES backgrounds across all genders have low participation rates compared to kids who come from higher SES backgrounds. And then Latinx and Black youth from low SES communities are faring the worst. They have lower participation rates in interscholastic sports compared to their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And additionally, when we think of having limited interscholastic sports, I don't think most people really think about, okay, why is that really important? But not having a diverse opportunity of sports could hinder well-rounded biomechanical development. Studies have shown that if you specialize too soon in one sport, it actually increases the likelihood of you dropping out of that sport a lot earlier, and then dropping out of sport in general. And then so when we look at African-American girls specifically, they tend to enter sport at an older age compared to other racial ethnic groups. And that's due to inequities within funding and education, since they're more likely to attend schools that lack the physical and human resources to offer sports at that school, and offer other opportunities for physical activity as well. And then additionally, the private youth sports industry, it's very expensive to play private sports. So that's also increasing that divide in the sense of if you don't have opportunities to play sport in school and you can't afford to play private sport, then where exactly are you going to get your physical activity from, particularly if your environment and your neighborhood also additionally poses a barrier from where you will get those physical activity. And a lot of the time interscholastic sports is kind of that main opportunity for kids to get physical activity, but also it's serves for some students serves as a jumping point to go to college and afford college through interscholastic sport as well. So just something as simple, as quote unquote simple as sports can have a very massive impact on a child's life, even just in adolescence and youth, but also into their progression into adulthood and also climbing that socioeconomic ladder by being able to attain tertiary education through sports as well too. And then it's important to understand that the resources of schools to be able to provide sports, again, could be constrained by school district funding. And there's a direct intertwining of the socioeconomic status of a community and what school districts in that community are able to provide, given that a lot of states in the US, specifically in Missouri as well, use property taxes as part of their funding mechanism or within their funding equation as well. So the objectives for this work was really to kind of examine how do interscholastic sports opportunities differ by school district and schools within St. Louis. And then I wanted to see what different neighborhood contributors that factor into the school district funding policy potentially have a role in interscholastic sports that are being offered at different schools in the region. So this is kind of just a very cursory overview of the Missouri funding equation. Their research has shown that there's a moderate to strong positive correlation between school districts with high property values and then the amount that's spent per student to educate those students. So here we have, let me change it to, so here we have the weighted daily attendance, state adequacy target, and daily value modifier. These help determine how much money will be required by a school district to educate students from the K through 12 level. And then here we have local effort, which represents the money that a school district can generate on its own. Property taxes comprise a large portion of that local revenue that's factored into LE. And then additionally, school districts can utilize lower property values or property rates from the 2004-2005 calendar year, when calculating that revenue for LE. So that allows for more affluent school districts to keep any excess that's generated over that amount without it actually being factored into their LE, right? So then the LE gets subtracted from this product here, which then gives you the state funding, which is the amount of money that is funded by the state. So to do this, I utilized the MISHA here, Missouri High School Sport Association, also pronounced MISHA. That's the governing body for interscholastic sports activities, which includes sports as well in the state of Missouri. And then that was used to create the Sport Diversity Index, which I'll show on the next slide. And that kind of serves as the primary variable of interest for this study. And then data from the census from the 2014-2018 5-year estimates. Those were obtained using Social Explorer. And then school district shapefiles were obtained from the National Center for Education Statistics as well too. And then the variables that were chosen in terms of the independent variables and covariates as well were chosen in consideration of the historical just property devaluation of homes in predominantly Black and low-income communities as well. With furthermore suggesting that if some research suggests that areas that are low income but have high renting or affordable housing, theoretically, it has a positive impact on property values. However, there's a complex interaction that's happening between the neighborhood characteristics, racial makeup, location, scale, management of the housing as well, that doesn't really play out into that positive impact in property value that we hope to see. So that's why rent-occupied housing was chosen as one of the primary independent variables, along with income inequality, which is by the Thale Index, as well as poverty as well too. So the Sport Diversity Index is a product of my overactive imagination and brain. So it's utilizing the entropy index as its foundation. And that entropy equation measures residential segregation. So with the Sport Diversity Index represents the variety or diversity of sports that are offered in schools within a given school district. So the index ranges from 0 to 1, with scores being closer to 0 representing less diversity of sport, with scores being closer to 1 representing very diverse. So for reference, which we'll get into, the max number of sports that are offered in Missouri under MISA is 27. Right, so I used web scraping to get the data from the MISA website, which included school name, type, address, membership county, those kind of things. And then also, most importantly, the sports that are offered at that school, with sports being coded 0 if they were not offered, and then 1 if they were offered at that school. And I used good old-fashioned Excel to do the data cleaning for that. And then utilizing different spatial joins with the census data, as well as school district data as well, which analysis was completed in both Stata, ArcGIS, and Geoda as well. Then utilizing local univariate Moran's I to kind of assess what the spatial autocorrelation looked like for the SDI and then other key variables, and then also bivariate local Moran's I to assess what the correlation between the primary variable of interest and other variables as well too. And then just to examine, okay, what does the neighborhood context, what does that do for or predict in terms of SDI in that given school district? I utilize different spatial regressions. I went with the spatial lag model at the end. I don't have time. If you have questions, I could go into why I chose spatial lag model. And then I used the ordinary least squares regression to just confirm, along with the autocorrelation results prior, that a spatial approach was necessary. So what did I find? So just kind of cursory for interest: basketball, both boys and girls, track and field, again, boys and girls, and then girls volleyball were the most common sports that were offered across the St. Louis region, followed up by 11-man football, and then girls soccer as well too. On average, so just so you know, St. Louis City is one school district. So the entire city of St. Louis is one school district that houses 13 high schools, whereas in the county is made up of more school districts, sorry, and then the average number of schools within a school district in the county is 2. The max number of sports that were played in St. Louis City by any school was 13, whereas in the county, there were a lot more schools that were closer to perfection, i.e. they were offering 24 sports. So that was the max number of sports that were offered at certain schools in the county. There were in both city and county school districts, there were schools that offered none. Those were special needs schools, which again, that's another research project to kind of understand why those schools aren't offering interscholastic sports, given the utility of sports for all youth. So that's just important to note as well. And then on average, schools in the city offered 10 sports, whereas in the county, the average was closer to 19. And then below here is the racial makeup for the St. Louis City School District, which again, it's 13 schools. And then here we have Rockwood School District, which was chosen because it was one of the school districts that had the max number of sports the maximum number of sports seen in the county, and its racial makeup also mimicked that, or was close to the other school districts in the county that had the same number of sports as well, and also same number of schools. So this is what the SDI looks like when we map it. So again, the SDI represents kind of what is happening in terms of the diversity of sports. So what number of sports, what kind of sports are being offered at school districts here. So we see further away from the city, so these school districts in purple, have near perfect diversity, which means they're offering almost close to the maximum number of sports that can be offered under MISA. Whereas within the city and then right up to a little bit in the North County, we see that it's just on the lower end of the index here. And then kind of just smack in the middle, kind of a band between there, we have schools that are just right in the middle in terms of the STI and and sports that they're offering to schools. So this is just looking at the key variables here. So rent occupied housing, this kind of shows, okay, there's a high concentration of rent occupied housing closer to the city, and then further away from the city, you don't have as much rent occupied housing in those school districts. And then when we look at the poverty rate, again, it's kind of centered very much in the north side of the city and then going into like North counties, but again, further away from the city into the west, into these school districts across here that also had high SDIs, there was not as much poverty. So then income inequality as well. So we see here within the city, again, there's high income inequality here, but then moving outwards towards, again, Rockwood Summit, those school districts as well, you have a lower measure of the Thale index. So then what does that autocorrelation or correlation of the variable itself in space look like? So with sport diversity, it was really high, meaning that, as we'll see in the map, the next map, sorry, we'll see that a lot of schools that had high SDIs were next to each other, and then schools that had, or school districts that had low SDIs were close to each other. And that band right through the middle, again, was not significant, right? So here we see schools that had high SDIs were very much close to each other, and then low SDIs were through here, right? And then kind of schools that were in the middle, for the most part, they weren't significant either. I will say that the schools that had the higher SDIs as well also had similar household income, similar racial makeup as well. And then the schools that were in the middle tended to be a little bit more heterogeneous when it came to their racial makeup as well as their income levels as well. So then what does that look like with the variables that we're interested in? So we see that there's a negative correlation here with sport diversity and rent occupied housing. And then similarly with poverty as well. And then also with the percent Black of the population as well. So here I only have for rent occupied housing and with sport diversity. So we have that the variable of interest, so the sport diversity index is surrounded by values that are dissimilar, right? So that's what that pale color means. So high SDIs are surrounded by low percentage of rent occupied housing here. And then similarly here, high SDIs are surrounded by low poverty rates here. So then looking at a spatial lag regression model kind of to see, okay, what do these variables, what does that look like for being able to predict, you know, the SDI? What does that relationship look like? All three were significant and associated. However, these Moran's eye residuals were still significant, letting me know that these weren't the best models to be able to predict what's happening with the SDI. So then when including the other variables of interest or the other covariates, this was the final model that was chosen based on model fit statistics, including the log likelihood AIC R squared. So the R squared showed that the model was a good fit. And that most of the variables here was significant, with rent occupied housing having a negative relationship with the SDI, right? So what does this mean? So the SDI kind of highlights something that was previously unvisualized in terms of when it comes to the inequality of interscholastic sports within the St. Louis region. It's a disparity that is spatially associated with some neighborhood characteristics that influence school district funding through that funding equation, given, you know, the high emphasis of property value and property taxes on school districts funds. And again, as mentioned before, that inequality in this interscholastic sport, while something that is not necessarily at the forefront of, this contributes to health outcomes in directly, it is something that should be considered because it can translate into potentially inequalities for future educational opportunities as well. But again, having sports and those kind of things, but not having the resources to have either safe sports as well. Now we're getting into that territory of how this could now translate to now impacting a youth's health as well, not just only through not having options to play and to have physical activity, but potentially negatively impacting their health and biomechanical development as well. And then considering using interscholastic sport, as I've mentioned before, in terms of advancing through college, may not be as utilitous as we think for low SES youth, if this great disparity is happening here. And again, because if you're in a high SES community, you're more likely to be able to afford private sports. And then per the NCAA, their data, when you look at the kids who are playing in the NCAA for the big three sports, with the exception of college football, most of those athletes play private sports in addition to interscholastic sports. So it's no longer just being able to participate in high school sports kind of gives you an opportunity to get a degree or proceed on to college. You now have to be able to supplement that with private sports if you're trying to compete at the same level to even get a scholarship to go to the NCAA, with the exception being high school football as well. That's one of these last bastions of high school sports where playing high school football still kind of provides you an avenue to be able to, have a shot to get to the NCAA. So, but there are some limitations with the SDI, with anything. It doesn't capture participation rates, the quality of the sport, nor the resources that are available at that school. All of those things are important to consider as well. Just because a school has a sport does not necessarily mean that they produced a team for that year, or that team kind of made it through that entire semester. Because I've worked at schools where we started off with a team, and by the middle of the semester, we had no team because we didn't have enough kids to play, and somebody got injured, and now the entire team's defunct, right? And then quality of sports is also important as well, because just because a school has a sport does not mean that it's a quality, right, that is going to allow you to compete at the same level with the other schools that you're competing at, which again could also increase your likelihood of getting injured as well too. And then the quality of coaching as well. So human resources and those kind of things are also needed, but also physical resources to train, to have access to weightlifting, and then also having access to appropriate healthcare, because injuries are kind of part and parcel to participating in sports. So if we're trying to get kids to be physically active and play and do that through sport, but we're not making it safe for them to do so, we're kind of creating a double-edged sword and kind of shooting ourselves in the foot potentially. Rent-occupied housing, though it was significant here, is not the best proxy for LE. For local effort, there are other variables that could have been chosen and that will be chosen for future work. And then this research did not include charter schools, private schools, and elementary and middle schools. And elementary and middle schools intentionally, mainly because if we're focusing on, okay, what does this look like for educational advancement, elementary and middle schools don't really factor in just yet. But looking at charter schools and private schools would also be something to factor in, particularly within Missouri and the St. Louis region, where we have a high concentration of charter schools as well. There were errors in the shapefile that I didn't really go into in terms of the methodology, but there were errors in terms of the school district shapefile and when trying to join them to census tract data, which is how I was able to get kind of the socio-demographics of the school district. They were rectified, they were fixed in terms of being able to join them using XY coordinates and those kind of things. However, because there were errors there, that potentially was compounded through the entire analysis as well as in the regression as well. So future work, I think, needs to explore, firstly, the idea of welcome theory as well, to kind of see if that's kind of contributing to why certain sports are offered in different school districts and schools in school districts. Sorry. So welcome theory is proposed by Dr. David Ogden. which was initially kind of used to examine why African Americans weren't participating in baseball as much. But there may be some merit to kind of exploring its application to just overall sport opportunities, because it's the idea that certain groups don't feel welcomed in certain sports or certain spaces, right? Because of historical precedents within the US and segregation and kind of keeping certain people out of certain spaces. But with baseball was used to be predominantly African American, and then it became very mixed, and then now it's no longer that. So it's trying to figure out what is happening and what's keeping certain minority groups from playing specific sports. Utilizing potentially the area deprivation index, which gives a better marker of what is happening in a specific neighborhood, maybe a better measure of neighborhood context to kind of see what does that look like with the SDI as well. But additionally, try to get school district revenue data and then also cost adjusted revenues per student to kind of see what does that look like with the SDI, and that would be me working with kind of an economist, which is beyond my scope. So I need to find a economist to work with. Additionally, like exploring quality of sport as well, because again, just because something's there does not mean that it's at the quality that it should be and needs to be, which again ties into funding and resources as well. And then also kind of the clinical cutoffs. And what I mean by that is being able to say, okay, if a school has or a school district has this SDI, this is what this potentially looks like in terms of predicting trajectories for student athletes from that school district. I think that would be really interesting to look at. And I think it would give a little bit more robust utility of the SDI as well. And then again, using the SDI for community engagement. So if we know, okay, there are limited opportunities here, there are less sports that are being offered in this school district, in this community, how can we now create different interventions that are centered around the community and the needs of the kids in that community to increase sport engagement, either through supporting the schools or through different community work. So yeah, so I think this kind of just highlights that there's an intersection here happening between something we don't necessarily think about when it comes to sports and physical activity, but also public health. And then I think it supports a shift in how we think about public health and then also sports as well, and what we can do to kind of make a change. So that's it.
That is really fascinating. I think I have to put my cards on the table. I grew up in Europe, and I think you said there's 27 sports that are listed in Missouri as sports. I don't know that I can name 27 sports.
Yeah, I think that's also just really unique to the American experience as well, too, right? I think coming from countries like, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago and then in the Commonwealth. So our big sports are rugby, soccer, as it's called here, cricket, netball, track and field, right? And you'll have the other smaller sports that are more niche, but are definitely controlled by socioeconomic status there. But in general, those main and predominant sports are what's played by the general public. So we don't tend to have like lacrosse and those kind of things. But that's also kind of the beauty of the US as well, right? So you have a wider opportunity and wider choices to play sports, because not everybody, like I could run track, but I'm not going to willingly run for no purpose. You know what I mean? If somebody's chasing me, I'll run. But to get me to run 100 meters willingly, I don't want to do it, right? But there are other people who thoroughly enjoy track. So it's good to be able to have other opportunities for kids to be able to participate and engage with physical activity and then engage with, their peers in a different way, right? And that also we know supports their academic outcomes as well. Even if they don't choose to go to college, it just healthy kids and active kids just make better learners, right?
Yeah. No, that's great. So we have a few questions come in, but I want to be mindful of the time. So let me pick one that seems to be a bit recurring. What factors do you think are missing in understanding what sports may look like for the kids, or as it relates to what other factors or variables could you add as a proxy for LE?
I think really and truly kind of drilling down into school district revenue data and kind of using that to really because I think that one, they'll give a closer measure to the LE, right? In terms of how much revenue is being generated by property taxes and property value for that school district. I think that will give a better measure for LE and be able to really narrow down a lot better in terms of what is happening there. And then I think in other factors that may contribute to why certain school districts have lower SDIs. I think taking into the historical context of segregation and those kind of things that have happened historically in the US, I think those things are just playing out on a slower scale and happening within the school districts of St. Louis as well too. And again, it's just another way through educational policy that we're seeing a disparity being played out through health, right, through the offerings of sport, but also in a way hindering their educational advancement to be able to now get to a different spot to be able to improve their health through education and income and those kind of things as well. I think thinking about offering again, the community piece of it, right? Because just because we introduce a sport to a school does not mean kids are going to play it, because kids will only do what they see, right? So if you don't have people in your community who play that sport, or you see yourself represented in that sport, that it's going to decrease the likelihood of kids being able to or wanting to participate in that sport. So I think, again, there needs to be some community interventions to be able to introduce sports to schools, but also ensure that we're getting kids to stay playing those sports.
Yeah, no, very, very cool. Unfortunately, we have to move on, but best of luck at your defense. And I don't know if it's a public defense. It seems like maybe there's more opportunities for people to ask questions there.
It is public. It's happening next Wednesday. So
there you go.
Feel free to come ask me questions there.
All right. Well, best of luck. Based on the work I see here, it looks really good and is very fascinating.
Thank you.
All right, so let's see if we can get Ted Lawrence come and talk to us. And I must admit that I can't find his bio anymore, but I can tell you.
I can do an introduction for myself. That's not a problem.
I was going to marvel at the fact that you have 3 or 4 master's level degrees.
I got some.
You got some? Well,
in addition to the PhD.
Of course, and the PhD. So let me just say that Ted is one of our amazing postdoctoral research fellows here at the Geospatial Institute and at St. Louis University. And you know what? Let me just turn it right over to you, Ted.
All right. Thank you, Henning, and good afternoon, everyone. And you can see my screen fine, correct, Henning?
Not yet.
You can't see my screen.
It is currently not shared.
Wow. Okay. Well, see, that's what I'm glad I asked, because it looked like it was shared to me, and then I was just gonna keep talking. Let me try this again. So
that's looking much better.
Okay. Darn, I thought I had it down beforehand.
Yeah.
See that whole minute I lost?
It, and here we are.
All right. So again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to talk about landscape change across the state of Yucatan. And I view landscapes as coupled human and natural systems, right? And I'm particularly interested in spatial relationships between land tenure, livelihoods, and land use and land cover. In addition, I'm interested in the drivers of that system, that particular system I just mentioned. So my research questions for this bit of research analysis I'm showing you today was, what broad-scale political economic processes influence changes to community land tenure and livelihoods? And in what ways do changes to land tenure and livelihoods influence landscape patterns and diversity? Now, this is important because about 1/3 of the world's forests are community managed. Tropical forests are predominantly community managed, up to 90%. And in the neotropics, community management is like 50% or more in most countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Bolivia. So there's real potential impacts to analyzing and understanding the interactions between land tenure, livelihoods, land use, and land cover when it's, for forested areas, right? And even more so because globally, there's been a shift in land tenure in these type of communities, and it's shifting away from community management and towards individualized and parcelized land tenure systems. And that might seem somewhat straightforward on one level, but really that there's much deeper meanings and outcomes for that, and how that shifting land tenure alters how people relate to vital resources, their natural resources, to each other in the community, to others outside their community, and to the broader political economy. Now, Mexico is a wonderful place to be examining community management, particularly because of the Ejido system, right? So the Ejido system came out of the Mexican Revolution shortly after 1920. And they were created by Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution. And these ejidos are were intended and did stay community managed for much of the 1900s. And the idea behind this creation of the ejidos was for subsistence agriculture, subsistence forestry, and to resolve some other land and resource inequity issues that were going on well before the Mexican Revolution. And they performed really well for many decades. Then some changes started to happen in Mexico's political economy, starting in the 1980s, that were related to or would affect the Ejido system. And in particular, there were changes to the food system in many different ways. Some examples are just changes in cutting subsidies, no longer agricultural subsidies to communities, Ejido communities, right? The idea behind that was really for these communities to start integrating themselves in a larger market, and not being supported as much by the subsidies. So if they're going to integrate themselves in a larger market, the market had to be really restructured as well, which they did. And at the time, all the food system was very localized. There was only two, maybe three large supermarkets in Mexico at up till that time. And most of the food sales were very locally based, community based, little stores, family stores. So that started to change, and they started allowing large corporations to come in. Walmart was the first one to go running in to Mexico, and really altered the dynamics in the food system. Beyond that, going into the 90s, and this was all part of NAFTA coming about, essentially, and in preparation for NAFTA, or lead up to NAFTA. There was a constitutional change to Article 27. Now, previously, these ejidos had to remain community managed, and they couldn't sell their land outside of the community. They could pass land through inheritance, like their membership as being part of the community or the ejido, but they couldn't sell the land, they couldn't lease the land, they couldn't rent the land, and that changed leading up in 1992, leading up to NAFTA, where the ejidos could divide up their land amongst the individual farmers attached to that were identified with that community, and they could lease it and sell it. They could rent it. It wasn't mandatory. It was an optional thing. So this is hugely important, because Mexico has like a vast amount of community managed lands that also manage forests. And these red polygons on this image are all of the ejidos across Mexico. They make up a huge amount, 30,000 across the nation, 52% of the national territory. and 60% of all forested land. So changes that influence the Ejidos, changes in the Ejidos, they really have rippling and different effects in many different ways. Right. And I was particularly interested when I started investigating Ejidos and doing this research. I was particularly interested in the state of Yucatan, and one of the reasons one of the reasons is that the Yucatan is part of the peninsula. The state of Yucatan is part of the peninsula, and it's a biodiversity hotspot. But at the same time, the federal government has identified it as a high priority region to mitigate landscape change. And the state of Yucatan, which you can see here in the red outline, all of those gray polygons are the Ejidos in the state of Yucatan. There's 710 of them across the state. And it's a similar proportion to what was going on across all of Mexico, where it covers 56% of the land and 64% of all forested lands. So to analyze these, I needed to create some buckets essentially, because the way Ejido parcelization, that shift in Ejido land tenure can happen, as I said, first of all, it's not mandatory. And second of all, you don't have to divide up all of the Ejido, the community's land. You could divide up half of it amongst the farmers, and the other half you could keep communal. Right, it's a continuous variable from zero to zero parcelization or individualization to 100% parcelization. So I was really interested in the far extremes, the least parcelized Ejidos, which I characterized as less than 20% parcelized, and the highly parcelized Ejidos, which I characterize as 80%. That Ejido's land is 80% or more parcelized. And you can see geographically on the map where those are located and where they're really starting to cluster in different areas. The red being the highly parceled Ejidos and the green being the least parceled Ejidos. So one of my first sets of analyses and research questions really dug into the agricultural commodity markets because of all those changes I mentioned, and its relationship to land cover and forest cover. And I did a lot of non-spatial exploratory analysis, and you can see a couple graphs here with the relationship between the amount of parcelized Ejido lands to the amount of commodity production. And this is agricultural commodity production, which includes crop, livestock, and forestry. And then also how deforested Ejido lands are associated with the amount of parcelized Ejido lands. And again, this is all non-spatial. So I quickly moved into, when I started finding these non-spatial relationships, starting analyzing it spatially, first using variographic analysis. And on the top right, you can see this map represents the municipalities of the state, and the red municipalities are the highest producing commodity producing municipalities, and there's spatial autocorrelation amongst them. And the second map, I'm showing the parcelized Ejido lands. Now this is a little different than saying parcelized Ejidos. This is just the parceled lands within the Ejidos is in red, and then the common use Ejido lands. And immediately you can see that the red parceled areas kind of overlap with what we're seeing up on the top map, right? And the variographic analysis showed spatial correlation between commodity production and parcelized Ejido lands. And then on the bottom map is tree cover. This is actually Hansen 2010 data. No tree cover at all in red, and gradually transitioning to very dark forest green, being a great amount of tree cover. And you can compare the maps again and see the spatial autocorrelation, which is showing up formally in the variographic analysis between parcellized Ejido lands and deforested Ejido lands. So then I had to take it another step and use spatial simultaneous autoregressive models to account for the spatial structure in the data to actually test those relationships. And I used the AIC to evaluate the particular relationships I was looking at. And this first one here is the association of commodity production with parcelized land is higher. There's greater association with parcelized land than there is with common use land. I also examined then I went into parcelized land essentially and said, okay, what agricultural commodity variables are associated with that parcelized land? And not a big surprise that agriculture or crop, pasture, land, livelihood, essentially, and forestry land altogether were the most associated variable with parcelized land. But when I broke those out, I was kind of surprised to see that agricultural or crop lands were more associated with parcelized land than pasture lands for reasons I'll get into a little bit later. But there's a good amount of cattle production in those red areas that I was talking about. So that was a little surprising to me. But nevertheless, that's the breakdown for how parcelized lands is related to different agricultural commodity producing lands. Then also found that deforested lands was associated more with parcelized lands, while densely forested lands was more associated with common use lands. So this provided me with a good grounding for understanding the relationships between sort of the livelihoods and the livelihood change that could be going on. This is all spatial, so there's no temporal in this yet. But understanding the relationship between land use, livelihoods, land cover, and specifically tree cover and deforestation. But I really wanted to get at looking further at the change over time, right? So to do that, I wanted to map the Yucatan, its land cover, pre-parcelization, essentially in a period between 1984 and 1988, and what I call circa 1986, and compare that to 25 years after, 20 years after parcelization, between 2014 and 2018, which I'm calling essentially circa 2016. So to do that, I designated 5 different land cover types that you can see here on the right hand side, and I developed to map those land cover types. I used their relationship with NDVI, and I did some statistical sampling and specified and clarified very discrete buckets of NDVI intervals for each land cover type, and it was also based, obviously, additionally, on literature and what I was finding in terms of NDVI, the relationship of NDVI related to land cover types. So I used that relationship to do a classification. I had 100 samples, training sites for each land cover, and I used the maximum likelihood algorithm to create the maps. And then my accuracy assessments came back very strong with high confidence and high kappa values. So here's the first map for 1986. So it's a single composite map, one map of land cover in 1986 that essentially represents what was going on in that time period between 1984 and 1980. And I also included the water on here. I just didn't really talk about that previously, but I didn't analyze it either. So for the post classification for 2016, we immediately see a huge loss in mature forest, the real dark green between the two maps. And it's surprising to look at the maps, but it's not surprising actually to if you're familiar with the literature and familiar with the region, my annualized deforestation rates were consistent with what the literature was showing for different deforestation rates in both the state of Yucatan and the peninsula more broadly. So it's sad that that's going on. But now, how does that compare in terms of ejidos and between parcelized ejidos and these common use ejidos? So I do want to make one distinction here, or clarify this point. And I'm not looking at, I'm looking at only three, particularly interested in the three land cover types here of mid-growth forest, shrub to early forest, and crop or grassland, because we already know we just lost a huge amount of deforested lands. Now there's parceled areas within the ejidos, and then there's the parcelization of the whole ejidos, and that's the distinction I make here on this bar chart. But if you look at the crop, and I believe that's crop and grass. Let me just check. Yep, the crop and grassland is much higher in parceled areas and highly parcelized ejidos compared to any other land cover type, land tenure type, excuse me, and particularly the common areas and least parcelized or common use ejidos, you might call them. But then if you look at those common areas and those least parcelized ejidos, they have much higher shrub to early growth. They have positive growth, and this is over time in mid-growth forests, where the least highly parcelized ejidos in the parcel areas had negative growth, and they lost additionally mid-growth forests. And these common areas and these least parcelized ejidos also had less crop, less change, less growth in the area for crop and grassland. So for total deforested lands, the highly parcelized ejido had a much bigger change over this period of time. And then within the parcelized areas, they too, again, had a much higher change than common areas and least parcelized. Not much more I can say about it. I mean, I think that graph pretty much says it all. So to kind of wrap up a bit, I just have a few graphs here showing the shift in land cover between 1986 and 2016. And you can see in the black was the distribution of land cover with this nice stepwise process as you go across the spectrum of land cover, where really everything was in the forest. And then across the board, across the ejidos, doesn't matter common or parcel, there was this shift, right, towards these just a crop or grass through mid-growth forest. Now that plays out too in terms of like a landscape diversity. There's lots of landscape diversity matrices out there, and I'm actually working on exploring, examining more of them for this data. Just here's some real basic ones to get an idea of how the landscape is affected in ways other than just there's no trees, right? So evenness, land cover evenness is essentially the relative distribution of land cover. And the graph here is the average across all 710 ejidos in the state. And you can see that evenness has gone down over time in all ejidos. Has gone down slightly, but still significant, statistically significant for richness. And richness is a relative number of land cover types. So that means there's a total of 5 possible land cover types. Ejidos on average might only have like 4. Right, so that's what that number is really capturing there. But I also looked at it between the common lands and the parcelized lands. And whoops, I didn't mean to jump to that. Oh yeah, I did. And we can see that same, largely because that mature forest drop down, that distribution sort of being centered in the middle. But then you can see in 1986, where the common lands, I can't see it with my, oh, there we go. Okay, the parceled areas have much more land in crop and grassland, where the common lands have much more land in mid-growth forest. In terms of richness, we're seeing not much, well, first of all, not much change in evenness, but in terms of richness, land cover richness, we're seeing common lands have typically have more different land cover types. All right, so I got to be finishing up here in a minute. This just represents, now we're back to talking about the whole Ejido. So least parcelized, or mostly versus like mostly parcelized or highly parcelized, and we can see that the highly parcelized or mostly parcelized Ejidos, again, not surprising, focusing their land use more than the common use Ejidos on bare land, crop, early shrub, where the common use Ejidos are doing the opposite. And in terms of evenness, we're not seeing any real difference in terms of evenness, but richness. Interestingly enough here, did I go back to, I'm sorry, I went back one too many. Okay, so actually here what we're seeing is the evenness was greater in mostly parcelized Ejidos. It was interesting just because they have probably greater, more amounts of similar types, more amounts of the types of land cover, essentially is what that is. So I want to move along here because I know we ran out of time. In terms,
just so you know, we if we go a little long, it's no big deal. The session is recorded, so if other people, if they have to leave, they can catch up on the recording.
Sounds great.
I don't want you to rush through it either. Do it
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I'm almost there. So in terms of people's use of land, here's another quick statistics. Highly parcelized Ejidos, on average, have 2 hectares more of pasture land per ejidatario. And then in terms of conserved lands, least parcelized Ejidos, the common use Ejidos, typically have 5 hectares more of conserved land per ejidatario. So that means a lot to individual people, obviously. And then the average total available land that they could be using is higher in least parcelized Ejidos, 4 hectares more. So really the overall message here for me is that land tenure is a key mechanism in landscape and environmental change. And one of the interesting things that and I'm looking at now is how this also relates to health. And you can recall some early graphs. I didn't show you the cattle one specifically, but this shows that relationship in particular between cattle and parceled lands, and then the deforestation in parceled lands. I'm working on some analysis now that shows the relationship between those variables and dengue fever. And in a non-spatial analysis, I'm seeing patterns there between dengue and the amount of cattle, and dengue and deforested lands, which isn't entirely surprising. But as I move into the spatial analysis, looking how land tenure, community versus parcelized or individualized Ejido lands influences those incidences, those case of incidents. So the message is, stay tuned till next semester, because I will hopefully be talking about that and what the health outcomes, the dengue cases are in the Yucatan as a result of parcelization. Thank you.
All right, that sounds really good. It's like a cliffhanger on here. You know, we're a little short on time, but somebody did ask the question about the sources of data that you're using for this.
Right. So it depends on there's several pieces of analyses there. So the first set of analyses between, whereas examining the predictors like commodity production variables, that information comes from INEHI. That's the statistical and geographic data. I don't think it's actually an agency, but it's a clearinghouse in Mexico, and it's like fantastic. It has some amazing.
Is it public?
It's public. Yeah, it's
Great.
spelled Inegi, and it's pronounced Nei. Yeah, it has amazing data on there, geospatial data specifically. So that's one side. The actual. So I have all of the boundaries for all of the ejidos in the state of Yucatan, also for all of Mexico. So if anyone's interested in doing any analyses on ejidos and need some geospatial data, I would love to work with you since I have those boundaries. That information I obtained, I had to go through some government channels. You can actually, anybody can actually get it, but it takes, it's not on INEHI's website, that's for sure. Then I used Hansen data for that first forest cover analysis, but then later I did the land cover classification using remotely sensed data from Landsat for that land cover mapping. Yeah, so those are the data sources.
Cool. And then maybe one parting question, and let me see if I can pull it back up. But if I can start to maybe paraphrase it. The question was, can you predict or explore, right, based on land use, can you explore bigger topics like political, water, or food instabilities or other health issues?
Yeah, I think it's wide open. I think in the framework or the context of ejidos and having that geospatially referenced, that geo-referenced boundaries for all the ejidos, right? That's aerial data. So it's just a matter of different kinds of variables that you want to explore that interact with ejidos or are within ejidos, right? So that data is amazing. And like I said, I not only it allows you to do lots of different types of analysis. Some I'm sure I haven't even thought of. Not just in the state of Yucatan, but I have it for all of Mexico. So I'm always looking for people who are interested in geospatial questions in Mexico.
Very cool. So after dengue fever, we'll have more cliffhangers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is a long career project for me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing it with us. We really appreciate it. And this brings our seminar series to an end. I love finishing it on the picture of what I assume is a sunset.
It's a sunset across the Yucatan from high above the forests. So happy Earth Day, everyone.
All right, and then hopefully you'll find your way back to us in 2 weeks from now. That will be the last seminar series of the spring semester as it's coming to a rapid end. It's amazing to think we're almost in May. In 2 weeks from now, we will have 2 presentations on remote sensing and violent conflicts from Caleb Bufa. And we will also have a presentation on premature birth and race in Missouri from Minisnat Tenney. So 2, again, very different topics. I just keep being amazed. These Friday sessions are just my favorites because I personally get to learn about all these things that are going on. So anyways, hopefully we'll see you for that. And we're always open for feedback, or if you're just interested in learning more, connect with us through our websites. So all that being said, wear your mask, keep washing your hands, even if there's light at the end of the tunnel. Stay safe and enjoy the weekend. All right, take care, everybody.